In the cold aftermath of the Second World War, Europe was not just a continent of ruins. It was a continent haunted by silence. The silence of graves, of burned villages, and of names that would never be spoken again. Cities were reduced to ashes, families torn apart, and nations left with wounds that time itself could barely heal. But beneath the rubble, beneath the scars of war, another battle began to take shape. A battle for truth, for memory, and for justice. This is the story of the Nazi officers who murdered 19,000 people, and how the world came to witness their reckoning. When the war ended in 1945, the Allied forces stumbled upon horrors that defied comprehension. The Nazi regime had left behind a legacy of death, concentration camps filled with skeletal survivors, pits overflowing with bodies, and entire communities erased from existence. The smell of decay still lingered in the air, and the echoes of screams seemed to haunt the ruins. In the midst of this chaos, investigators began uncovering evidence of a particular group of men, a small Nazi unit stationed deep in Eastern Europe. They were not fighting a traditional war. Their mission was not victory. It was extermination. These men were members of what history would later call an execution battalion. They were not soldiers in the noble sense of the word. They were executioners in uniform. Their victims were not enemy combatants. They were civilians, families, and entire villages. 19,000 souls lost under their command. Their orders were simple and merciless. Eliminate resistance, destroy the Jews, punish anyone who dared to defy the Reich. They surrounded villages, rounded up the inhabitants, and executed them in cold blood. The cries of mothers, the confusion of children, and the despair of the elderly filled the air as bullets silenced them one by one. Photographs taken by the perpetrators themselves would later become some of the most horrifying evidence in human history. Images of men standing beside open graves, of children clutching each other moments before death, of officers smiling after executions. For years, these men believed that what they had done would remain hidden forever. As Germany fell, many of them tried to disappear. They removed their uniforms, changed their names, and returned to ordinary lives, pretending to be simple farmers, mechanics, and laborers. But history has a way of finding the guilty. In 1946, as the world struggled to rebuild, Allied investigators began the slow, painful process of tracking down war criminals. They gathered testimonies from survivors who had somehow escaped death, from soldiers who had turned themselves in, and from documents left behind by the fleeing Nazis. Piece by piece, the investigators uncovered the truth. A battalion responsible for killing 19,000 innocent people had left behind a trail of destruction across Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. Their crimes were systematic, organized, and deliberate. The evidence was overwhelming. Orders, reports, signatures, and eyewitness accounts that painted a picture of unimaginable cruelty. One of the key commanders of the unit was finally captured and brought to trial in 1947. The courtroom was packed with journalists, witnesses, and the families of victims. The air was heavy with grief and anticipation. The world wanted answers. The man who had once commanded death now stood powerless, his uniform replaced by prison clothes, his arrogance stripped away. The prosecution laid out the case in excruciating detail. They read testimonies of mothers who had lost their children, of survivors who had escaped gunfire, of soldiers who had watched the massacres unfold. The evidence was undeniable, and yet, when asked about his crimes, the accused showed little remorse. He spoke of duty, of obedience, of orders. He said he was simply following commands. But the world no longer accepted that excuse. The Nuremberg trials had already established that following orders could not absolve a man of crimes against humanity. Each individual bore responsibility for their actions. And this man's actions had led to the deaths of 19,000 human beings. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom fell silent. Guilty. Crimes against humanity. The sentence, death. The execution was to be public. Not for revenge, but to make a statement that justice, though delayed, would not be denied. On the day of the execution, the sky was gray and cold. Thousands gathered in the square. Survivors, soldiers, journalists, and ordinary citizens stood together, united by the need to witness the end of a monster. The condemned were led to the gallows. The sound of boots on stone echoed like the ticking of a clock counting down the final seconds of their lives. Some survivors held photographs of their loved ones, while others wept silently. As the ropes were placed around their necks, the names of the victims were read aloud. The list went on and on, each name a reminder of a life cut short. When the trapdoors opened, there was no cheer, no applause, only silence. The same heavy silence that had followed the gunfire in the fields of Eastern Europe, but this time it carried a different weight. It was not the silence of fear, it was the silence of justice. The executions were filmed, and the footage soon spread around the world. Many found it disturbing, hard to watch, but others believed it was necessary. Humanity needed to see what justice looked like after such evil. The trials that followed in Nuremberg and across Europe revealed more than just the guilt of a few men. They revealed the terrifying truth of how ordinary people could become agents of mass murder, how ideology, propaganda, and blind obedience could transform teachers, policemen, and farmers into executioners. These trials forced the world to confront an uncomfortable question: how could human beings do this to one another? The execution of those Nazi officers was not the end. It was a beginning, a symbol of accountability in a world desperate to rebuild moral order from chaos. Across Germany, Poland, and other occupied lands, hundreds of similar trials took place. Some perpetrators received long sentences, others managed to escape, and a few vanished into obscurity. But for the families of the 19,000 victims, no punishment could ever feel like enough. Justice, though necessary, could never bring back what had been lost. Decades later, historians would uncover even more evidence: letters written by soldiers confessing their guilt, photographs hidden away by families, diaries describing the daily horror of executions. Each discovery reopened old wounds, forcing new generations to confront the legacy of that violence. For the survivors, the memories never faded. Some spent their lives giving testimony, ensuring that the world would never forget. Others remained silent, unable to relive the nightmare. The story of the Nazi executioners serves as a warning about the fragility of morality in times of war. Evil does not always come wearing horns or cloaks of darkness. Sometimes it wears a uniform, carries orders, and believes it is doing what is right. The men who committed those atrocities were not born monsters. They became monsters through ideology, fear, and blind loyalty. This is why remembrance is vital, because forgetting is the first step toward repeating. The black and white footage of those executions, though difficult to watch, continues to serve as a mirror for humanity, a reflection of both our darkest depths and our potential for justice. Each frame reminds us that evil, when ignored, grows. When confronted, it trembles. What happened to those 19,000 people cannot be undone. Their lives, their dreams, their voices were silenced. But through the pursuit of justice, through the telling of their story, their memory continues to live. It speaks to us across time, reminding us of what happens when hatred is allowed to rule. And so, as the world moves forward, we must look back, not to dwell in the past, but to learn from it. Because history is not just a record of what happened. It is a warning of what can happen again. The silence that followed those executions was not emptiness. It was a message, a whisper from the past, telling us never to forget. This is War Echoes, where the past speaks, and the silence of history finally finds its voice.